Let's start. Let's go through some of these quarterfinal games. Let's go chronological order because um, we'll just rip the Band-Aid off for you and your Buckeyes, and then we'll end on the thriller that was the Sugar Bowl. Was an unbelievable finish and confusing finish as well, with like the three
Yeah.
different endings to that game. So let's talk about Miami's win over Ohio State, 24-14. This was one where like I woke up on New Year's Day and I still could not believe that Ohio
Mhm.
State lost this game because of the way that they lost that game. We were texting throughout, but I want to give you the floor of what exactly happened, what stood out for the way that both of these teams played, called it, approached this game, leaned into their strengths. What did you see?
Yeah, I think it's one of the more interesting outcomes here because like you can even look at the box score and be like, are you sure that Miami won? And this is not to disrespect Miami, but it's the idea that it wasn't this like, they clearly came out and were just doing whatever. It was a very much like they owned very specific things that matter in this sport, which is the trenches on both sides. And they had the plays that mattered. And really it was the pick six that swung the game. But I look at Miami, and we talked about the rushers, Ruben Bain and Akeem Mesidor, and how they could ruin somebody's day. And they ruined Ohio State's day and Julian Sayin's day
Yep.
in particular. It started with the pressure early in the game. And I think that trickled more into Julian being gun shy and missing some reads and having his timing sped up. And so they hit him, and I think that mattered. But I also thought that Julian Sayin missed a lot of plays, much like he did in the Indiana game. And those were the two games where he was under the most duress. So that was like big alarm for Ohio State and who they are. But Miami obviously took advantage of the opportunity there in a huge way. I flip it over to the other side, and we kind of went back and forth on this. Miami definitely owned the line of scrimmage when they had the football, but 150 yards rushing or whatever it was like their season averages, 72nd rushing offense in the country. Like it wasn't like this big 8 yards per carry type of game, but they had timely runs. In the Carson Beck using his legs, the more I
Yeah.
think about that game, that to me was the difference maker because they were in, a 2nd and 8 that became a 3rd and 2. They had a 3rd and 11 that became a first down. They had a 1st and 10 that became a 2nd and 2 because Carson Beck pulled the ball down when the pocket got even just a little bit messy. He didn't have his greatest day throwing the ball in terms of production. But that to me is the encapsulation of the game is Miami said, okay, we're going to come in here and we're going to do what we do on the lines of scrimmage. And that mattered a ton. And then when it was time to make the biggest play in the game, the one that swung it, because Ohio State was driving, it was 7-0. All of a sudden it's 14-0. That's when
Yep.
the game was done in my mind.
Yeah, there were a couple of moments because it still early on felt like Ohio State was just going to come back and win the game. But I'm with you. Carson Beck runs huge moments. Because
They
again,
were huge.
we were saying this early in the game as the game was unfolding, because you're looking at, hey, what are the key factors? We talked a lot about this. This is Carson Beck who can be good, he can be bad. He can
Right.
he can throw picks and he can throw them in bunches. But if you're up 14-0, you don't need to risk anything. You don't need
Yep.
to throw balls that could possibly get batted around or get picked off. And it set up a situation where Carson Beck was not going to cost them the game. And then obviously with his legs, he was able to help them extend drives or go out there and win it. But it was just kind of stunning. You mentioned this about Julian Sayin in their biggest games. In Ohio State's biggest games, the offense did not show up. And that dates back to the first game of the year, which we said, like, okay, they would call it so differently, right? Like with Julian Sayin having more experience, not being in his absolute first game as a starting quarterback. But like, it's almost like we just took for granted that the offense would show up, would be prolific because there's so much talent out there. And there were great receivers to throw to. We watched the run game be up and down, but we watched Julian Sayin be reliable, be productive, be prolific, complete a lot of passes over the course of the year. And then in these biggest moments, the offense could not step up. Like it could not get, like we talk about in basketball, like creating your own shot. I feel like this offense could not create its own shot if you get the parallel.
Yeah, I think the shot was there. I think that's the most difficult thing if you're an Ohio State fan watching the game back is like the play before he threw the pick six, they had it dialed up and Julian was so rattled that he didn't hit it. Right. And there were a couple plays like that from Indiana. There were a couple more in this game. And I think that to me is the hardest sign is like your quarterback's rattled and he's got to be better on that situation. But then you ask the question, why does that happen? And it's because you got him sacked 5 times the game before, and he's looking at the 2 pass rushers that he's going up against this day, and he's watching his guard be ass over tea kettle. Like,
is some of that because they were not tested a lot during the year?
Yes,
like
and
we
no.
wondered about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the signs were there. So yes, they weren't tested, but also I think through the course of a year, you anticipate that your quarterback is going to, he's still a young player, but you feel like he's going to be able to withstand a little bit more of that, right? Like just have that maybe one extra beat in the pocket, keep your eyes downfield, don't worry about the rush to his game. And I feel like that's the biggest part of the Julian Sayin development off of this phenomenal year that he had is he's got to be a little bit more willing to stand in there under fire.
If that is not a pick six, if it's an incomplete pass.
Yeah. Might be a different game.
I think Ohio State wins the game.
I don't want to say it because
I think it's
Miami
possible.
won the game, but
I know,
it feels like it would be a different game. I agree.
I feel like it would have been very different. Like that really did, for how early it happened, feel like a backbreaking moment.
Yeah.
And it just felt like because they had started to get things going.
I know. Well,
it felt like it would have changed it.
The getting things going, the third quarter was one of the most intriguing things to watch because of how Ohio State came out. And I felt like they had Miami on their heels and they decided not to go fast. And I think part of that was because Ohio State's defensive line was so thin on the interior that they didn't want it to become a game of how many reps can we get. I think they were still trying to play efficiency, and that might have been a miscalculation. And so again, like when you talk about this battle, it comes down to the idea that Mario built his thing around the lines of scrimmage. He wasn't worried about his guys being tired or worn down or rotations or any of that kind of stuff. He was going to play whatever game he needed to play that could play into the hands of the up front because that's where his advantage was. And when it came time maybe for Ryan to make that choice of, can we go a little bit faster? He had to say maybe not, because I'm not sure about the depth up front when the defense is on the field and I want those guys to be too tired.
It's really interesting because the Mario Cristobal at Miami, this whole tenure, he's an offensive line guy. Like they built it from the trenches out. And it took a few years to get like enough pieces on the outside part, right? And to get the defense better than it was last year. Like there were a lot of different things that had to happen, but there was a plan. The plan has been followed. There were moments you weren't sure about it. Obviously, they needed the selection committee to have some faith in them and put them into this thing in the first place. But man, that was a huge win. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about Indiana in just a second too, but having to go through Ohio State, the defending national champs, obviously there's a lot of different players on that team, but it's still Ohio State. It's still the
especially
defending
with
champs.
The history of Miami and Ohio State too.
Yes.
Right. Like
it was a big deal.
Ohio State fans always joked about ending their dynasty. And like Miami's like, we got our get back. And maybe this is the start of our next little run here.
It is really something. And again, Miami is now 1 game away from playing basically a home national championship.
Insane.
This is crazy, crazy stuff we're talking about.